Thank you for joining us today. My name is Allison Van, and I'm the Executive Director here at Spark, a Center for Social Research Innovation. Welcome to today's Spark Talk, Doing Duo, a collaborative and feminist method with Jessica Hardin. I'd like us to begin by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations as the traditional inhabitants of the lands where my master stands. To say that is to acknowledge a debt to those who were here before us and to recognize our responsibility to respect and honor the intimate relationship that Indigenous peoples have with this land. We're thrilled to welcome Jessica Hardin, who is the Honorable Barber B, Conable Jr. Endowed Chair in International and Global Studies and an Associate Professor of Anthropology at Rochester Institute of Technology. She's a critical medical anthropologist whose research focuses on chronic illness, prevention, and diabetes in Samoa. Work as a duo-ethnographer is grounded in her collaborative work with the Nutrire CoLab. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Allison. So I join you today from the traditional territory of the Onondaga, the people of the Great Hill. In English, they're known as Seneca people, the keeper of the Western Door, and they are one of the 6 nations that make up the sovereign Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And so at RIT, we honor the land as that was built and recognize this unique relationship that Indigenous stewards have with this land. And this relationship's at the core of their traditions, cultures, and histories. And we recognize the history of genocide, colonization, and assimilation of Indigenous peoples that took place on this land. Mindful of these histories, we work towards understanding, acknowledging, and ultimately reconciliation. So thank you. I'm really pleased to join you today to talk about my work with the collaborative group CoLab and to learn about the work at Spark as well. So I'll start by introducing myself. So I'm a feminist, critical medical anthropologist. I have worked in the Pacific Islands for the past 15 years, and in particular in Samoa, and am doing recent work here in the Rochester area, focused similarly on chronic illness health disparities and the relationships that people develop in and through diabetes, and in particular, new work around chronic illness technologies. So I come to this as a white North American anthropologist, also working in the Pacific Islands, which has fundamentally shaped how I think about methods and research relationships and reciprocity. And that's something I'll touch on in a bit after I introduce the Duo project. Actually, sorry, I need to pause here. I just realized that my little talking head means that I can't use my animations, and I need to use my animations. So I'll have to not be the little talking head as I was. Okay. For the purposes of the recording, I will start again right here and say, why am I giving this talk? So I came to this method with the collaborative group that I mentioned by accident, and this was in the context of the pandemic. As a group, we gathered for a double conference panel at the American Anthropological Association meetings in 2018 on something we were calling chronic disaster. And we just really enjoyed each other's company. And we had a long dinner, and we realized that we had personal interest in each other as well as intellectual commitments. And so we decided we would meet again. And one of our senior colleagues hosted us for a workshop for several days the following spring. So that would have been 2019. And at that time, we named ourselves Nutrire and developed a kind of rough set of kind of guiding principles that I'll share with you in a minute. And then the pandemic hit. And when the pandemic hit, we were already talking about duo. We were corresponding via email. And I think as all of us were craving connection and really concerned about the state of the academy and this pandemic moment, we also came together with various points of pre-existing relationships. So some were friends, some had met before, some had done things together professionally. So there was some like cohesion that allowed us to come together and develop some trust with a group of people that were ultimately colleagues that came to be more than that. So it was in this context of isolation and the intersection of our general interest at a group in nourishment and as feminists that we began to explore duo. So I'm pulling this photo up or this image up because it gets at kind of the things that we were concerned with, which was around feeding, caring for children, for ourselves, for our partners, and for elders, all in the context of teaching our children, teaching our students, and maintaining the ever-present pressure of productivity. Nutrire is a CoLab. We're a group of women scholars who identify as feminist, anti-racist, and we're mostly anthropologists. We decided to call ourselves Nutrire after the Latin to mean to feed, to cherish, and in Spanish to nourish. And so while we came together to articulate a critique of chronic metabolic disorders as strictly diet related, and we talked a lot about kind of thinking about not just diet, we wanted to instead articulate the ways in which diabetes is the result of racist, patriarchal policies and systems that are rooted in settler colonialism. And we contrasted this work to the kind of enduring focus in medical anthropology on structural violence as big disaster moments. And instead, we focus on mundane, slow, everyday forms of violence. We're also a feminist group of scholars that seek to nourish each other, sharing resources, co-mentoring, and co-laboring to produce new bodies of scholarly work, a public presence, but also ultimately a community of scholars. And so we developed this description together, tweaked it in person via Zoom meetings over the pandemic as well. And what Duo allowed us to do was employ a framework for building trust, intimacy, and our commitment to working together. And so what this mission does is it really gets at that overlapping commitment to our intellectual interests in nourishment, but also in nourishing each other as a praxis. And I'll say that we don't all study food or even diabetes. And in fact, our work has continued to change outside of these keywords, but nourishment still as a theoretical frame is something we're working together to think more broadly about outside of those kind of metabolic critiques that brought us together. So again, thinking about the pandemic. So with these commitments in mind, we began to share and read the various critiques that were emerging across various forms of media, from the inside higher ed to scholarly articles, the public media, about the uneven care responsibilities that predominantly women were managing and the unequal effects that had on promotion, tenure, being in the context of the academy. And so we were reading papers like these, which are all cited in our feminist anthropology paper. And so this is all to say that context matters. And while that should be obvious to all social scientists, what I mean by context here is not just the context of how to interpret the data that we produce together in this kind of context of headlines, but that the choice of our methods is also a contextual decision. The motivation that we have to use certain methods always reflects our positionality and perhaps a politics that often goes unnoticed as we think about context in terms of data. And so what Duo does is allows us to think about the context of methods and data as simultaneously produced. So what was attractive to Duo for us, and how did we make it feminist? Duo-ethnography comes from the work of Joe Norris and Richard Sawyer, who developed this method as a way of kind of mutually exploring their differences and relationships in the academy. And it's been used by all kinds of scholars to explore difference and create space for sharing experiences of power, for example. So the underlying idea of duo-ethnography is the belief that given each individual's geographically and culturally situated history, socially constructed meaning is transient with multiple perspectives on a construct. So that I think there's so much to say about duo, but what I like about that quote is that a single construct like the COVID Academy, which brought us together, or nourishment, is going to have multiple perspectives on it. And what Duo does is it searches to find ways to pull out difference to avoid the flattening effects that qualitative analysis can, which is something we seek, right? If we think about saturation or qualitative themes, we're looking for coherency, but Duo encourages us to think about difference as oriented towards a single meaning, a single concept. And so we took this method and we developed it with feminists scholars in mind. So Donna Allen Davis and Krista Craven, say Harry Sandoval's Methodology of the Oppressed, Ruth Behar, and then Sandra Harding. These were all kind of inspirations for us as we were thinking about duo. And let's see here. Duo was important to us because it was a process of mutuality. So this is a process that involves continuous revision and integration of data collection and analysis as simultaneous. And it provided a framework to guide our genuine interest in each other and as a way to learn about ourselves and others through our shared and also not shared experiences. It allowed us to uncover meaning and dialogue where the work of interpretation is shared. And so most of us are ethnographers. So we come to this with experiencing working with others to develop interpretations under ideas that meaning is contextual, is uncertain, and is constantly changing. I think what makes this feasible as a feminist method is that differences are a strength. And this is central to the original conceptualization of duo. Though not feminist although inspired in some ways or in conversation with feminist methods, it's not explicitly feminist in its original formation, but recognizing difference is central to how we think about our own feminist practice, how we relate to one another as a group, as containing multitudes of differences, whether that's around sexual orientation and identity, or race, or rank and position, status, etc. We contain a multitude of differences and hold space for those differences. And as a result, as a dialogue process, it encourages us to reconsider preconceived notions, both based on our kind of perceptions of ourselves, perceptions of others. And it's a process of challenging those presumptions and allowing space for questioning, perhaps even reinvigorating those assumptions with the support of others. So it's a process that aims to encourage partners to create trust and vulnerability, while it also requires trust and vulnerability if they're already. And here, drawing inspiration from Sandoval's idea of the trickster or shape-shifting positionality, we can think about this as a technology of social transformation. So that Praxis is the idea that by doing, you are transformed. The same thing goes with trust and vulnerability. By initiating that trust and vulnerability, you are transformed by it. And it draws inspiration from thinking about bell hooks and challenging cis hetero white patriarchy or capitalist patriarchy, and Bianca Williams' idea of radical honesty in the classroom and otherwise. So these are all core feminist approaches towards transformation, of which duo provides a framework, one in which we developed as a collective format for kind of continuous commitment to each other and to building a certain kind of world. So here's the paper that we wrote for field methods, which is in the short takes in particular is a fantastic series of step-by-step guiding through new methods. So if you're trying to learn new methods or think about how to break up methods, it's really fantastic. It's led by Chu, leading in anthropology, Amber Wooditch, and Russ Bernard. So I'm not going to belabor the steps here, but I will annotate them instead. So step 0 is building community and acknowledging difference. So we start here because our ongoing relationships and commitments are important for duo and in fact, fundamental for it being meaningful. So for us, this ongoing building of community meant scholarly collaboration, mutual aid, and a kind of genuine commitment to lifting each other up. And so while we talk about our differences and we hold space for that, we also brainstorm whose voices are missing in our various conversations and collaborations. And we come to think about collaboration as an ongoing process of incremental reciprocity. And step 1, gather participants and compose pairs. So duo-ethnography, traditionally a long-term relationship between two people. We wanted to extend it to a collective activity. And so of our broader group, Nutrire, we asked who wanted to participate in this particular project. We randomly created pairs as a result. And you'll see we're an odd number. So not every interviewer was paired with the same interviewee. Some were mixed and matched. And what this did was it created a continuous conversation with the whole group that expanded beyond the individual pair. And there was an interviewer and an interviewee. There was a kind of mutual dialogue in those in particular conversations as well. So it wasn't a strict interview in the traditional sense of the term. After doing that, we developed our interview guide. And again, duo traditionally open-ended, maybe topic focused, but because of the group formatted, we wanted to create some kind of grounding for us to think together. And so we developed a rough outline of topics to cover and some questions. Not every group did it exactly that way, but they all had a coherency around our topic, which was care and COVID and nourishment. Let's see. Then each pair organized themselves to have their interviews. And they recorded them on Zoom, shared them with each other. And then we agreed that individual participants could choose the genre that they write in. So it could be poetry, it could be creative, it could be a traditional qualitative thematic analysis. It was really up to the writer in conversation with the person that they interviewed. And they wrote about the other. So they didn't write about themselves, they wrote about their other's experience. And so after the interview, everybody goes home, they listen to their recording, they read it, they do their writing, and then they share it with their partner. And this sharing process is really critical because it gets at issues of consent ultimately. So not only was it at a time to answer questions or provide more detail or clarify intention, it was also a time to revise, edit, and remove things that people weren't comfortable sharing with the outside world, right? Maybe sharing with the intimate partner of an interview is one thing, but sharing with the outside world was something different. After that, when each kind of pair had finalized or each individual had finalized their contribution, we shared them all in a Google Doc. And then the first level analysis was led by Megan Carney and Emily Yates Dewar to pull out the themes. And the tricky part here is to honor the kind of duo approach to difference while also looking for coherency of themes that are demanded by the publication form of an article or a book is a tricky line. And so Emily and Megan spent a great deal of time reading, pulling out themes. They generated themes, shared them with us as a group, and then we all read them. It raised more questions. We corresponded by text and email and narrowed that group down into a smaller group of things that we decided we wanted to share with the world. And at that point, Natalie Valdez took charge and did the work of ensuring that there was coherency in our discussion, but that we also didn't de facto flatten our differences and create a universalizing effect, but to instead hold space for our various positionalities, experiences, and differences. And Natalie also did the work of ensuring that each of us individually were comfortable with what was shared with the public, and honored our differences and our preferences for how we were represented in the text. And so it resulted in this paper for Feminist Anthropology. And our last step is ongoing collaboration. So the work of collaboration, this is perhaps the most challenging part, is that duo represents a specific moment in time, but it's well suited for tracking relationships over time as well and recognizing that relationships change. So the nature of our collaborative has changed. Some people have onboarded, some people have offboarded, but having a flexibility and a mutual respect for that kind of coming in and out is essential to recognizing the various kind of commitments that we each bring to this and the complexity of our lives in the academy and elsewhere. I wanted to just highlight one of the unexpected things that came out of this work, which was, so we're a group that came together to theorize and think about nourishment and hold space for nourishing each other, while also recognizing that nourishment is labor and quite challenging. And so this kind of, you can read the first line here. I know I won't say the word, but it was one of the most profound findings to say, we are fully committed to this, but wow, is it really hard to do this work, nourishing up and down the generations and parallel to each other in this work as a group. So I encourage you to read it. And I'll highlight here, and I'll say it again later, that one of the benefits of working in group duo is that it affords anonymity, in that we were permitted to say things that maybe we might not have said in a co-authored paper, because it would be clear who was saying what. So this is the kind of Sandoval trickster approach of shapeshifting. By holding space for everyone's perspective, we also protected one another from any potential consequences professionally or even personally from the things that we shared in this group format. So I think that this is a real innovation on the duo format for protecting vulnerability. So for the takeaways, I want to say that this is a process that provides a basis for strong knowledge claims and a praxis of strong objectivity. So here, drawing from Susan Harding's idea of strong objectivity, and that the myth of the subjective objective distinction that protects universalizing neutral, ultimately white male gaze, and that to recognize our differences and hold space for them is actually to produce a more true empirical form of reality that represents the diversity of the human experience and the diversity of kind of our relationships to power structures. The group format provides anonymity and allows for greater vulnerability. And this is something that's coming from me personally, that this method I think is resonant with Indigenous methodologies, and in particular Pacific research methodologies. And I have a slide on this in a minute. Because of its focus on dialogue, collective witnessing, and consensus building, which doesn't mean agreement, but that kind of a mutual respect that can come from group dialogue. And we use this as part of a larger collaboration, and participants can opt in and out when they want, as a way to recognize that the kind of our life worlds are quite different, and we don't always have the space to do this kind of work. And collaboration can involve conflict and disagreement, and that is part of collaboration. And that duo can be one of these methods that you use to work through group differences, or work through disagreements, or work through conflict that happens. So I'm highlighting here the Pacific research methodology space. So I'm coming from spending some time in Aotearoa at the University of Auckland, where I was learning as an outsider about this space of Pacific research methodologies. So Linda Tuwai Smith's book, Decolonizing Methodologies, clearly has had global impact, but there's an enormous amount of research, and these are just a handful of these leading scholars developing Pacific and then also Pan-Pacific methodologies that honor cultural difference. And so what I want to highlight here is that these research methodologies come from a similar moment in thinking about postmodern feminist phenomenological methods that recognize reflexivity as central, and that are also built from a post-colonial critique. So the Pacific research methodology space, of which this 9 reasons why Pacific research is important comes from Edmund Fehoke, is to say that methods are built from epistemological and ontological assumptions, and that Pacific methodologies recognize that difference and build knowledge from a different place than the traditional Western canon, and then therefore the kind of structures of the university and ethics committees and grant funding agencies that are rooted in a Western kind of hegemonic approach to knowledge. And that these methods challenge how colonial methods continue to reproduce harmful, negative, and ultimately reproduce structural violences through their very research itself and their representations of Pacific people. And so Pacific research methodologies privilege Pacific researchers leading methodologies as a form of redress and repair, and also bring forward the essentialness of reciprocity as an ongoing community kind of conversation and not a one point in the design process. And so coming back to North America from New Zealand and realizing the profound way in which research is conducted differently just highlights the incredible impact that these research methodologies have had on reshaping what is normal in research. And so this is just a paper I highlight here that I wrote with my colleagues that come from two collaborative projects with colleagues in Samoa, in Australia, Fiji, Vanuatu, towards building trust within our teams before even writing grants or doing the work or developing the methods, right? But that we came together through a series of Talanoa sessions that were guided by Talanoa facilitators to put on the table how we orient towards research and then our needs and wants and desires, professionally and otherwise, to recognize the multiple forms of expertise that was in the room. And so I do this duo work with Nutrire, but it's related to this work in the Pacific space about rethinking, certainly, expertise and research design, and to say that research design can start from a different place than from the kind of traditional scientific method of research reproduction around findings, because that will and does reproduce colonial structures of research in the sense that often research begets research when you reorient it towards a kind of approach towards mutual aid and commitment to each other as colleagues and bring in those commitments to communities, then you might get different results in the actual research. And these scholars are. So I encourage you, even if you don't work in the Pacific space, to learn from what these scholars are doing because they're fundamentally challenging what research is and should be. So here's our new group with our current memberships, just to say thank you to all of them for their continued commitment to our work together. I'm really privileged to be in conversation with them all. And thank you all for joining us today. So I'm happy to give it back to Allison or answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. There's a lot to engage with here. I'll take a minute and check in with those joining us. If you have a question, feel free to either just open your microphone or put it in chat if you would like me to ask it. And then if no one has anything urgent, I've got a couple that might start us off and inspire other people's thinking. Okay. Oh, first is asking about whether the slides can be shared. We're happy to facilitate that.
Yeah, I'm happy to share the slides.
Else?
Well, you muted. Sorry, muted.
Hi, thanks very much for taking my question, Allison. And thanks very much for your presentation, Jessica. I really enjoyed it. I was just curious to know a little bit more about the process that you went through around the regular meeting in looping through your various steps. I think there was 5 steps in total. I'm just curious about the timeline, how long that took, and how regularly you met. It sounded like there was some online communication and how people were able to come in and remove themselves depending upon the intensity of the work that they were doing outside of the academy, given, again, the expectations around COVID.
Thank you. I was just thinking about this before I came on to think, how long did that take? Because of the ways in which pandemic time is hard to remember. My memory is it was like peak pandemic, a 6-month period of kind of from start to like really writing the manuscript in earnest. And so I'll say 2 things about the opting in and out. I think there's 2 ways to think about opting in and out. There's a larger group. So we have an email list and we email someone's interested in doing this and you say, okay, who hands up wants to participate? People participate and then you go off and make your own group. But then maybe within that group, I really wanted to do this, but I can't, but keep me involved. It's a kind of risk recognizing that people will show up when they can. And if they don't, that's also fine. And in that comes we have a very open discussion about authorship, right? About who is in need of what, who wants to lead, who doesn't, et cetera. And very inspired by the CoLab approach to thinking about to authorship and labor. So that's one way to think about it. And the other way to think about the opting in and out, like I said, is the bigger group. So we're starting, a smaller group is starting a new duo conversation around field work and eating and food as kind of ethnographers, feminist ethnographers who have studied food being in the field. And so it's the same method. We email the whole group. Some people say, sure, I want to be a part of this. But we've been having that conversation for 6 months via email, and it hasn't got off the ground because we're all busy. And we're going to start again in May. These are all the kind of intricacies. I think what the important part is a mutual respect for showing up and knowing that people show up when they can. And if they don't, that's also okay. It also is because this is not for any of us our main kind of mode of productivity in terms of thinking about the neoliberal university and the kind of ways in which we need to produce X amount of articles in X amount of time. And so it relies upon us doing this as an extra because we're committed to it as colleagues. And so it takes some of the pressure off for, I need this pub now, which is the realities of at least the American Academy, which most of us are located in.
Great. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Along the same lines, I'm really interested in the emotional labor aspect of it. These are topics that often touch at the heart of a lot of the sensitivities that people who are female identified hold. And I'm curious about some of the structures around managing the emotional intensity of the different experiences, or these aspects of engaging via text or email or online as maybe somewhat of a buffer with that.
Yeah. I think the group like self-selects for people who are willing and interested in doing that kind of emotional labor. So I think that there is like that self-selection is really important in this space, that there is a genuine interest and commitment to learning how to labor in that way together and recognizing that we don't know all how to do it at the same way at the same time with a large group. And so in our gatherings, a lot of that work is trying to sort out that kind of, how do you manage intimacy and at this kind of scale? And so we try lots of different things and they're not always successful, and not always successful in the sense that not all emotional labor has neat and tidy endings, but that kind of overall value of doing this work together means people keep showing up. And I do think you're right that there's multiple ways in which people are engaging. There's our email, there's individual text, there's group checks, there's like our meetings that we can get to. We have meetups at our various conferences. And so the personalities are often always changing, which keeps us, I think, out of particular kinds of dynamics, right? Because there's an opting in and opting out based on bandwidth for that labor. Yeah, we've had meetings where we grow and then we contract, and we grow, we contract, and I think everyone's willingness to let it go is also important. That this is not a thing that has to exist forever, but collaboratives have lives. And so right now it has a life, but it may recede and become something else, or it may change.
Two slightly related questions. One is, seems like it really helps to have a relatively large body of researchers that were at least willing to consider being part of this and could come in and out, particularly because of the focus on not getting to one answer, but exploring the diversity that you really would want that range. Do you have a sense of what's the minimum number of
That's a good question.
researchers?
I think so I don't know how many we're like 15, let's say. And that allows for someone always to put their hand up, right? It means that the email almost always gets answered. So I do think that having that threshold of, in order for people to receive there has to be people who are there, which means you need a big enough number. I think any bigger, and this is something we talked about a lot as a group, you risk the intimacy, right? And as a group, I think there's a desire to bring more people in, but then also a kind of recognition that too many means it's difficult to put yourself out there in the same way. So I'm hesitant to put a number on it, but I will say there is some sweet spot between having enough people who have the space and also respecting people who need to take a back seat. But if you're in a group of 3 or 4, then everybody always has to put their hands up where they feel like they're being called upon in ways they can't honor. I do think that the 2-person duo is a radical form as well, and is important and has its space for that kind of individual dialogic form of relationship and interpretation. Putting it in the collective form makes it a different kind of politics as opposed to not strictly, but like a particular kind of genre or exploratory mode. And that's what this group is interested in exploring.
Allison, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't want to take up too much space here because I noticed that there's a few others that are on the call, but given that they don't have their hand up, I thought I'd take advantage of it. I was just curious, Jessica, about the application of the duo in cross-cultural research. Because there's obviously going to be a lot of differences, right? I'm sure with your own experience in the Pacific Islands, for example. I'm doing research in Nordic countries, primarily Iceland and Sweden. And although there's some similarity, obviously, being both white, for example, and female, there's some variation with respect to language and cultural norms and expectations and so on and so forth. So I'm just curious. I know you spoke a little bit about decolonizing methodologies, and unfortunately, I haven't had the opportunity to read Linda Smith's book or explore some of the other authors that you suggested. But I'm just curious to get a sense from your own experience how the Duolingo works, or the duo-ethnography rather, works with this cross-cultural issue.
Yeah. It's a great question, and one that I don't want to put duo and Pacific research methodologies as the same. They're different, but they do have a similar orientation towards questioning, critiquing, and reformulating traditional objective Western modes of extractive data collection. I want to hold up an example for one of our Nutrire members, Alicia Galvez, who wrote a chapter for a project that I'm working on with another one of this group members, Emily Mendenhall. She wrote a chapter about diabetes and birth with her long-term interlocutor, Fred Manuela Fuentes. And I think they're not calling it duo, but essentially it's duo in the sense that they're writing their story of knowing each other and working together for 30 years in New York City as first anthropologist and research participant, and then like companion. And I'm using companion there. Sophie Chow uses this word in her work to describe our relationships with our interlocutors, our friends, our research participants. Companion is an apt word. And so I think in many ways, duo can be something that ethnographers are doing with their companions all the time, especially ethnographers who work in the same place for decades and have relationships with friends that surpass the research object of diabetes, gestational diabetes, whatever it is, and become friends, but friends that are always reckoning with their differences. And if duo is about bringing through difference, it is a way in which American scholars approximate the process of working through difference with a genuine curiosity for mutual transformation, as people who hang out with anthropologists are often committed to themselves in the way that anthropologists are. And I have a friend, my long-term companion, who journals and loves to write, and she's one of the most intellectually curious people I've ever met. Mafi, if you watch this, I'm thinking of you. And I would love to write something with her. After having done it with this group, I thought, oh, she and I can do something and explore something together. So I will say that thinking about that cross-cultural issue is important, particularly as it relates to textuality and relationships to literacy and genre. But duo doesn't have to be textual, right? It can take many forms. And there is a long discussion in the duo literature on the artifact that people are relating to. Maybe it's like a photo, maybe it's a video, whatever it is, the elicitation point. I do think that's important to think about, but I think that the centering point of pre-existing intimacy and like genuine interest in mutual exploration that encompasses cultural difference is a worthwhile pursuit, whether you call it duo or not. I don't feel like I'm an evangelist for duo. It happened to be a useful method for us to explore, but it doesn't have to be the container for that kind of intellectual exploration.
Yeah, it sounds like it's like as a qualitative researcher who does primarily unstructured interviews and thematic analysis, there's certainly a lot of overlap with what's proposed here. But I think the difference is the importance of the subjective experience of the actual ethnographer or the researcher, right? So that exchange becomes part of the research. And I think that's really important given the importance of positionality in qualitative research more broadly. But I think it also requires us to be much more intentional about the work that we're doing around the questions we're asking and the relevance of those questions to our own personal lives, right? So the work I do, for example, on sustainable tourism, my area is really looking at nature and wild places in particular as therapeutic, primarily for mental health and overall well-being. And the work I'm doing in Iceland and Scandinavia is really about exploring that through the experiences of individuals who are fortunate enough to have access to these wild places. And here in Canada, and certainly throughout the United States, with your excellent national park system, there's also that sort of accessibility. But it's not everybody that has that access, right? Recognizing those limitations, similar to the way I think your group initially recognized the limitations of the academy before, again, working within the structure of the research question, which was really looking at COVID care and nourishment, right, as academics living in that particular time. Sounds like it was extremely therapeutic for all of you, which I love.
Very therapeutic. Yeah, it was great. What I think what you're bringing up has raised two thoughts for me. One is the process of doing this work with these colleagues, and then also learning about specific research methodologies in Aotearoa has changed how I orient towards my research in the islands and here in Rochester in two ways. One, in that kind of to never presume that I know what communities want from research. And so fundamentally reorienting towards how to develop a research question and beyond a single moment of consultation, but a more agile approach that doesn't always fit the structures of the university and structures of funders. So trying to find ways in which to satisfy the bureaucratic institutions that we live within and challenge them to be more agile in terms of relationship to communities and recognizing my obligation for reciprocity to those communities. And something that we did in this practice, which was to give people the transcript and give people the writing and say, edit, what do you want in here? What do you not want in here? Which is standard practice in Aotearoa for the process of transcribing interviews, like making sure that the participant is able to review, edit, change. Of course, there's limitations to that. There's things about communications, and we could go up and down on the limitations. But if we throw the kind of questions of limitations out, but honor the sentiment as the fundamental part about ownership of data and voice and consent, then that's like a process, a practice that I will now move forward with, right? But it was through normalizing it with this group and leaving North America or America, I know the Canadian context is quite different, that then that became the normal baseline for me, that I hadn't been trained that way, right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't take a radical feminist collective to have that kind of exchange. It can be normalized as basic social science.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I
think that's
yeah. I'm just curious as well if there's time, Allison, about whether or not there was any ground rules established in the collective.
So we are running out of time, and I want to respect everyone's time. Maybe I will phrase this question in the chat first, and then if we have time, we'll come back to that, Allison. Okay, so the question is, what are some of the challenges you faced in your collaboration and partnerships, and how were they addressed?
That's a good question. I don't know if I could answer as an individual representative in this group. In talking about duo, much of our conversation is turned to speaking for this collective. And so I can't do that because we all have our different experiences of these challenges. I will say that perhaps the challenge has been one of the emotional labor, and two, in confronting the entrenchedness of white supremacy, even in feminists, and confronting sitting with the discomfort of kind of accidental white feminist presumptions that exist within well-intentioned people, which I can teach about in my classes and write about up and down. But doing it in person is hard, and that's the work. That's what they say. But then also allowing time for healing and more, often emotional labor. And again, we'll put this out there. This is a group of women doing this labor on top of they're already, not speaking for myself, but for others in the group, wildly productive, successful careers. So that there is a critique to be had. And many in the group do talk about the hyper productivity of it all. And that standing back and sitting back is also important. So I think the challenges are around the emotional labor, the recognition that we all, and some of us have come to be anthropologists because we're interested in this kind of work. We come to this group because we're interested in this kind of labor. Recognize that it is also a burden, and that takes space from our other intimate relationships and our professional commitments. And being willing to power structures at play within our own intimate spaces, and not walk away from it, but to listen, I think. And this is, again, coming as like a white, cis, hetero woman into this space, which is a very different thing. And so we, as a group, are working through those things.
Do you have time for the final question from Allison, or should we get a do, and perhaps she could email?
Yeah, I'll just say very quickly. Yeah, I think we set ground rules all the time. We don't have one set of ground rules. We have an internal set of guiding values. They change when we maybe are doing something as a group in a paper. We'll set some rules. So here's some things we're thinking about. Here's how we can communicate. So I think it's a constant negotiation and articulation. The most important part is, I think, ensuring that each participant feels like they can contribute and assert those needs, wants, and critiques of people in the group without everything falling apart. And that's the harder part of developing kind of resiliency as a group. Yes. And I've learned to do that now in all my collaborations, is actually from this group, in terms of setting the expectations about our wants, needs, professional and otherwise.
Yeah. I think it requires a good amount of maturity from the sounds of it. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I appreciate it, Jessica.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a wonderful weekend, and take care. Thank you so much, Jessica.
Thank you.